All right, we are live. Hello, everybody. We'll just give everybody a few minutes to join and to kind of give everybody, something to watch. In the meantime, we're just going to have a bit of a pre-show banter with our special guest this evening. So, for one thing, hello, Colleen, and welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it should be great. Do you mind telling us a bit more about what you do?
Yeah, for sure. So I recently graduated college actually last year, and I work at this small startup called R2C, and we essentially make this open source static analysis tool called SumGrab. So I am on the security team for R2C, and we do a lot of rule writing, security research, and I've been doing a little bit of program analysis and front end work on the side.
Oh, that's awesome. How do you feel? So you're based in San Francisco. So how do you feel how do you find it being in the security industry in San Francisco? I mean, like one of the things that I was kind of curious about is you can go to like Google and like the big tech companies and sorry, let me re-ask that question. So in San Francisco, it sounded like um, the big tech companies can host like OWASP and other security meetups. Like, have you been to those, and how are they?
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question. I think, especially since I started work right when COVID hit, really, it's been a little bit difficult to, find those communities. Um, but I used to be, or I used to go to some women in cybersecurity meetups that were hosted by like people like NVIDIA and things like that. So um, there's definitely those communities that exist. I just haven't really been too actively seeking them out ever since COVID started. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've kind of had the same issue here in Toronto, where like we have a very thriving security community, lots of different meetups, but it's been hard to find the motivation to like go to all these like virtual meetups and
Mhm.
um, you know attend all these like Zoom classes. But
For sure, I feel that. Like, props to the people who are listening to this, for sure.
yeah, definitely. But yeah, so I guess another thing that I've always wondered, as a security developer, how do you find um, you know like kind of the like how do you find like how do you solve the problem where um, like your main goal is to output code as fast as possible, but you also have to remain secure. So like how do you kind of deal with that problem?
Yeah, also a really great question, and sort of things that we all want to solve as people in the security industry. And I think it's really relevant, especially since I work at a startup, and we obviously want to like move fast and make sure that we're never blocking developers. But because we're a security startup, we have to make sure that our security hits like a certain standard. So it's sort of a problem that we've been thinking about, and I think what we've been thinking about means basically eliminating vulnerability classes in general has really contributed to being able to sort of balance moving fast and being able to um, develop securely. So yes, definitely. I hope this talk will help us think about that.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to seeing that. Because I think a lot of my friends have looked at the product that your company does from a like penetration testing perspective, like basically using it offensively. Have you ever considered that angle from your
Yeah,
product?
for sure. I think it's a great tool to also be able to use offensively. One of my coworkers, he's basically very into bug bounties and a very great pen tester. Um, yeah, he's definitely used this tool in order to find vulnerabilities, and then submitted them to HackerOne for bug bounty programs. So it's definitely a tool you can use in that purpose. We also have our own sort of MapReduce analyzer that you can use SendGrip to scan widely on like a bunch of repositories So we use that in order to validate our rules and also to look for vulns if we have time. So definitely a tool you can use for both offense and defense.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I guess that's it for the pre-banter. It's about 6:35, which is when we normally start. So I'll just kick things off like we normally do. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the May OWASP Toronto chapter meetup. My name is Adam Greenhill. I'll be host for this evening. But before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. For starters, if you're looking for work or you're hiring, please leave that in the chat now. And if you have any feedback for us, we're always looking for improvements. You can use the form in the description of this video. Additionally, if you're looking for CPE credits, please leave your name and email in that same link below as well. So with that in mind, I'll pass the floor to Colleen, and she can get started.
Awesome, thanks so much. I'm just gonna start sharing my screen. Okay, awesome. Seems like that has worked. So today we're going to be talking about eradicating vulnerability classes with secure defaults. And here's a brief summary of what we'll be talking about today. So before we really focused on pen testing and bug bounties and eliminating specific bugs, but today we'll be talking about a different way to approach security, which is killing bug classes in general. And the reason why this is important is because we believe killing bug classes is more scalable, systematic, and has longer-term wins than eliminating specific vulnerabilities. Killing bug classes also lets developers move fast and securely, and see the security team as business enablers, not just another point of friction. So we'll be talking about how to really implement this at your company using free and open source tools. So who am I? My name is Colleen, and today I'll be talking about eliminating bug classes. And I'm currently a security software engineer at R2C, and I graduated last year from Stanford with my bachelor's of CS and my master's in stats. And R2C is a static analysis startup, and our mission is essentially to improve software security and reliability. Awesome, so here's a brief outline of what we'll be talking about today. So we'll first touch on why bug finding isn't the answer, and then we'll talk about how to eradicate vulnerability classes in general. And then after that, we'll talk about tools and techniques to actually make this happen, and then do a brief case study of what R2C has done. So over the years, software development has changed pretty drastically, and security teams must change with software development too. So in many companies now, security teams can rarely hard block engineering. And if you do hard block engineering, you must be almost 100% sure that it's something important. Security testing also is encouraged to be continuous, not just once a week or once a month pen tests or analyzation. Yeah. So we're also trying to focus on building and not just breaking. And we want to be embedded or partner closely with developer teams. So because of this changing environment, we have to revisit our prior assumptions about what we've done before. So there's been these massive shifts in technology and security over the years. So before we had waterfall development, which followed in sequential order and essentially was a lot slower than what we do now, which is more agile development. So agile lets us continuously iterate and also develop and test at the same time. Before, there was also separate developer and operations teams, and now we've sort of combined them into DevOps. Also before, there was a lot of on-prem software, and now we have moved a lot to the cloud. So I want to just propose that before we were focused on finding vulnerabilities, and now we should be shifting to secure defaults and invariants. So a lot of forward-thinking security-focused teams seem to be focused on secure defaults and invariants. And what exactly is an invariant? So it's just a super fancy way to say a property that must either always or never be true. And the reason why these are important is because if you specify specific invariants, you don't actually need any context to make a decision. And this means if you don't need any context to make a security decision, there's no operational time for the security team. And we can do this super quickly and save a lot of time. Okay, cool. So let's say we have this random web application and we want to see if this web application has XSS. So before we are actually able to truly know if this application has XSS, we probably have a lot of questions. Like, what does the user actually control? Arbitrary strings, integers, etc. Is the input filtered before it's ingested in the database? And how is it stored in the database? Is it a JSON blob? Is it integer? Is the data actually filtered before it's sent to the user? And how is it actually inserted? Is it inserted with HTML, JavaScript? We need to know a lot of things that are sort of contextually relevant in order to actually say whether an application has XSS. But now let's say that we know our guardrail is that our front end is in React, which is good at preventing cross-site scripting. And we've banned this sort of escape hatch that lets you just convert data into HTML directly, which is dangerously set in our HTML. So now, if we know that our front end is in React and we've banned dangerously set in our HTML, we don't really need all this context. We don't really need to know whether the user controls arbitrary strings, where input is filtered. We trust that React is good at preventing XSS, and we don't have this dangerous escape hatch. And we can be pretty sure that this application doesn't have cross-site scripting. So of course, there's still some edge cases and nuances we're probably concerned with, but my guess is that you probably care a lot less about these things and they're a lot less likely. So essentially, we want to solve the easy version of the problem. So this application could have been super complex with millions of lines of code, but with some super strong secure defaults, we've actually significantly reduced its risk. And we did this without a lot of fancy tools. We don't need DAS that can handle single-page applications, GraphQL, modern front ends, etc. We don't need SAST whole program analysis that tracks attacker input flowing across dozens of files into sinks. We don't need fuzzing. We don't need symbolic execution, and we don't need to prove correctness using formal methods. As long as we set these invariants and secure defaults, we can be pretty sure that something doesn't have XSS or another vulnerability. Okay, so here's a brief diagram, a quick diagram that essentially shows task versus effort required. And effort required is in Clint's hand-wavy units, and Clint is the person who wrote these slides, so we're going to just use these hand-wavy units as some data. So essentially, this is not very precise, just basic intuition, but detecting use of insecure libraries is actually pretty easy. For instance, you could just grep for cases of using exec, etc. And this is quite simple, and it's a lot easier than finding an actual potential bug. This is because finding a potential bug actually requires some security knowledge, also sort of digging through your code base, looking for specific things. And confirming a real bug is even harder than finding a potential bug. What's even harder than that is actually writing code that exploits this bug, because of course writing code is hard. So before we get into the actual process of killing bug classes in general, we want to sort of take a step back and think about why we're so focused on trying to kill bug classes in general. Why does this help us, and why is this good for us? The reason that we want to do this is because this actually gives us and our AppSec teams these great compounding effects. This means that you get more leverage with your time. So for example, let's say that we review what our AppSec teams do on a day-to-day basis, and we come up with this model. Roughly a third of the time spent is on XSS. Another 1/6 is spent on triaging bug bounty and SQL injection, and the rest of the time is spent on security training, running security tools, etc. So let's imagine that we're able to actually completely wipe out XSS from our company's repositories, and we have a pretty good sense that XSS is not a problem anymore. Then all that time we used to be spending and worrying about XSS, we can now spend on something else. So the same way for SQL injection. So if we eliminate this, we have a lot more time in order to spend on things in the backlog and things that we should have gotten done but had no time to. So ultimately, we're able to get more done with the same size team because these classes of things that we would be worried about, we just don't have to worry about anymore. So the core takeaway I'm trying to get here is that detecting the lack of use of secure defaults is much easier, a magnitude of difference easier and more precise than being able to find every bug. And of course, here's an obligatory meme because we want to reconnect with the youth. So you might say, all you've shown me is some hands-wavy diagrams with not that much data. And why should we change? We've spent already so much money on pen testing, bug bounty. The security industry has focused on this for decades. And why should this all change because of your hand-wavy diagrams? Well, let's take a look at people who are not just us. So in this AppSec Cali talk by Patrick Tallman and Asta Single from Netflix, this is what they decided to de-emphasize and heavily emphasize in their security program. So they decided to de-emphasize manual testing and traditional vulnerability scanning and are instead heavily emphasizing paved road, secure defaults, and killing bug classes in general. Furthermore, if we look at Microsoft, while they were switching from XP to Vista, they actually stated that 41% of their vulnerabilities were reduced from just banning string copy and dangerous functions like that. So a lot of their vulnerabilities were just removed from just by banning insecure and unsafe functions. Google also released this book called Building Secure and Reliable Systems recently, and essentially they've written that it's pretty unreasonable to expect any developer to be an expert in all these subjects and to constantly maintain vigilance when writing or reviewing code. So essentially security is hard, and writing software that's both performant and is actually secure is even harder. So expecting our developers to write performant code that is also secure is a little bit unreasonable. So a better approach than expecting developers to always write secure code is to actually handle security and reliability in common frameworks, languages, and libraries. So ideally, libraries only expose an interface that makes writing code with common classes of security vulnerabilities impossible. So Google is also supporting this idea of secure defaults. So let's take another look at Facebook. So essentially, Facebook has said that they invest heavily in building frameworks that help engineers prevent and remove entire classes of bugs when writing code. And if you look at their defense in depth model, at the base layer is secure frameworks. So essentially, secure defaults and secure frameworks are at the base of their funnel, and that's the groundwork that they use in order to build their security tools and automated testing tools upon. So you might say, but I'm not Google, Facebook, or Microsoft. So why does this stuff still matter? Well, essentially, framework and technology choices truly matter on how secure your code is. So if you're able to use a modern framework or a framework that is able to secure things for you, it can mitigate classes of vulnerabilities. So for instance, using modern web frameworks and things like DOM Purify for output encoding and Tink for crypto will really help you actually mitigate classes of vulnerabilities. And here's a picture of the Wild Wild West because that was what web security was before modern frameworks. Awesome. So now we sort of talked about why bug finding isn't actually the answer. So let's move on to talk about how we can eradicate vulnerability classes in general. So we've distilled this down to a simple 5-step process, essentially. And this 5-step process is to first evaluate which vulnerability class to focus on, to determine the best approach to find and prevent this vulnerability class at scale, and then to select a safe pattern and make it the default. Of course, we also need to train developers to use the safe pattern and then use tools to enforce the safe pattern. Awesome. So our first step is evaluating which vulnerability class to actually focus on. And here's some common selection criteria. So we might want to think about bug classes that are the most prevalent, the highest impact or risk, the easiest to tackle, whether that be organizationally or technically, or the bug class that fits in with organizational priorities. So more realistically, we probably want to do some weighing of all 4 of these things and come up with a bug class that's weighted the highest. Awesome. So if you have a strong vulnerability management program, then this is really useful to actually evaluate which vulnerability class to focus on. So this means that if you do have this vulnerability management program, this means that you probably have some historical data to draw on for prioritization. So with this, you might know which bugs you've had and fixed historically. You might know which ones are currently live, and you might be able to measure your progress against specific bug classes. So you also may be able to just slice and dice your vulnerability management data across these dimensions. So you can use this in order to find these vulnerabilities that are the most prevalent or the highest risk, et cetera, with real-world data from your actual company. So you can track, for instance, severity, vulnerability class, source code responsible, the PR introducing or fixing the issue, the relevant code base, the root cause, mitigating factors, etc. Cool. So if you don't actually have a vulnerability management program, you can also look, for instance, at Jira or GitHub issues tagged with the keyword security. You can create a list of security relevant keywords. You can search your merge or pull requests, your issue trackers, your GitHub commit history. You can look at security tool reports, pen test reports, bug bounty submissions, or even ask security or development teams for examples. So once you have sort of collected a list of prior vulnerabilities to review, you want to be able to actually review these prior vulnerabilities for trends. So ideally, after all of this investigation and collection of actual real-life code, you're able to find a bunch of examples that you can go through and analyze for similar patterns. So you might want to ask, does this vulnerable code look similar? Or is there a repeating pattern in this vulnerable code? So ideally, we want to be able to choose a vulnerability class that is widespread across your teams and repositories, is pretty high risk, is feasible to get your developers to actually fix, aligns with company priorities, and has some pattern that is consistent among the examples. So it's always broken in sort of the same way. But we don't obviously live in an ideal world, so sometimes it's just worth it to just pick a vulnerability and try to eliminate it. So this might be something like SQLi, might be XSS, might be code injection. As long as you pick one and eliminate it, this will still be pretty useful. Okay, now that we've chosen the bug class, we want to figure out how to fix and find this bug at scale. So depending on what we're trying to do, different solutions are better. So if we find big picture architectural flaws, this might mean we want to invest in threat modeling. If there's cloud misconfigurations, we might want to invest in infrastructure as code scanning. But we're just going to focus on this last bullet point over here, which is if we actually have known good or known bad code. And if we have this, then we can use pretty lightweight static analysis in order to find these instances of bad code. Cool. Awesome. So now let's move on to step number 3, which is selecting a safe pattern and making it the default. So there's 2 parts to this, and we'll first talk about selecting a safe pattern. So for determining how and what safe patterns are, you can leverage some internal coding guidelines that your company has, and you can also leverage things like NIST standards or your own personal knowledge. You can also just go around and ask people who are more senior in the company and ask them what the actual safe pattern is. So another good thing to look at is actually the OWASP community's efforts that have basically collected many people's expertise over a number of users. And essentially these 2 tools are OWASP cheat sheets and the OWASP ASVS standard. Awesome. So now let's move on to the second half, which is making the safe pattern the default. So it's important to update documentation because that's what a lot of developers actually reference. So updating all internal coding guidelines is quite important. So we want to update READMEs, developer documentation, wiki pages, FAQs, etc. We also want to work closely with the developer productivity team. And I think one thing that really stands out to me is that the secure version should have an even better developer UX than the old way. So this way we can increase developer productivity and security at the same time. So we want to essentially make sure that the new version is easier to use than the old version, or it adds some extra functionality. For instance, it could add telemetry or logging so that developers find it more useful. So another thing we want to do is integrate security at the right points. So for instance, we could have new project starter templates in order to get automatic widespread adoption. Right, so a good quote that we can think about is by Asta Singhal, who said, "Hitch your security wagon to developer productivity." Awesome. So now that we've talked about selecting a safe pattern, we need to train developers to use the safe pattern. And it's important to communicate this to developers and make these communications successful. So what and why something is insecure should be very clear. And we should use terms that developers understand with no obvious jargon. So essentially, we're not super sure what developers understand and how deep their security knowledge is. So it's always better to be very upfront. It's also always good to wrap why this is important in the sense of why does this matter to the actual company. And we need to convey impact in terms that developers actually really care about. So this might not be security, but it might be risk to the business. It might be how security might damage user trust, reliability, uptime, etc. Also, how to fix the issue should be very concise and clear. So this way, developers have a clear next step and are more willing to actually change this issue because it's much easier. So we can link to additional documentation and resources with more information in case developers want to really read up and inform themselves about why this issue is bad. And also a thing to suggest is having a communication channel with developers so that they can just bring you questions and ask you if fixes should be unclear. Awesome. So now let's talk about step number 5, which is using tools to enforce the safe pattern. So we can use lightweight static analysis as we were talking about when we were talking about step 2, such as grep and linting in order to make sure that safe patterns are used. So ideally, we want to run these tools on developer machines so that developers get faster feedback and are more willing to actually fix issues, as well as in CI. So what tools can we use? Well, we can use grep, which is super easy to use, really interactive and fast. Grep is also really easy to iterate and works on all languages, so it's a very easy tool to get started with. The con about grep is that grep actually understands source code as a string instead of, as if you recall to compilers or program analysis classes, code is actually a tree. So essentially, grep doesn't actually understand the AST structure that code actually is, and therefore it's not as powerful as things such as code-aware linters. So code-aware linters, on the other hand, are super robust and precise. They handle white space comments, they understand what function calls are, which things are string literals usually. And but the con about code-aware linters are they're sort of hard to actually customize. And this is because code-aware linters are usually pretty language specific, such as ESLint, etc. And this is because each language has its own grammar, which parses into its own AST, and it's difficult to sort of understand these ASTs and sort of customize your own rule because you would need to understand the grammar and how the ASTs parse. So it's sort of difficult to customize code-aware linters, and therefore they're a little bit hard to use if you want to write sort of custom rules. Awesome. So now that we've talked a little bit about what tools we can use, we can talk more in depth about tools and techniques. Awesome. So this is, again, our 5-step process. But in order to determine the best approach to find and prevent this at scale, a good strategy to use is continuous code scanning. Furthermore, using tools to enforce the safe pattern, we can check for escape hatches in secure frameworks in order to enforce the safe pattern. Awesome. So now let's first talk about continuous scanning. So there's actually a lot of work written about continuous scanning. So Twitter, Salesforce, Netflix, in Cisco have all done talks about continuous scanning. Everyone does it a little bit differently, but I think we can sort of take away some pretty similar things from all these talks. So we put together this slide about best practices of continuous scanning. So some best practices are to scan on pull requests. So there's also the option of scanning on every commit, but we've realized that that's a little bit too noisy, especially because there might be work in progress commits, and essentially you don't want to scan these because it can be pretty noisy. So another thing that is quite important is scanning fast, preferably less than 5 minutes. This is because giving feedback while the context is fresh is very important, and we don't want developers to just forget the context and then come back to the code and have to context switch back on to understanding their code again. So obviously some scans will probably take longer than 5 minutes, but we can do these more in-depth scans daily or weekly. So another important best practice is to have 2 scanning workflows. So one for audit, which doesn't block developers and essentially probably has more rules with higher false positive rates. And this audit workflow is mainly used for the security team for visibility. So there's another blocking workflow that is good to use, which tells the developers this is important. We're pretty sure that this is actually an issue and please fix this. So blocking issues should be quite confident, but audit issues don't need to be so. So another thing about continuous scanning is that we should make adjustment easy. So it's important to make it cheap to add and remove tools and new rules. Awesome. So this is actually taken from Google's tricorder paper, which is their static analyzer. And essentially, this shows what tricorder really does and what we think should be incorporated into best practices. So I think it is important to show the tool findings within developer systems. And this is pretty important because developers are able to be immediately alerted. And this could be, for example, showing the issue as a PR on or as a comment. Another thing that tricorder does that is very useful is it captures metrics about check types, scan runtime, and false positive rates. So it does some analyzing behind the scenes, and tricorder actually tracks and evicts low signal checks. So actually only keeps checks with 95% true positives. And this is very important because false positives are such a huge blocker for adopting static analysis tools. So we want to make sure that false positives are as low as they can possibly be, and that's every issue we raise or flag is most likely important. So keeping checks with actual low signal will actually cause ill will with developers and too much security team operational costs. If you also look at the message that tricorder outputs, it's pretty clear and actionable, and it actually provides a link with more information. It also provides a suggested fix, which is very important. So essentially, even if the fix isn't perfect, it's important to show a suggested fix because it encourages developers to fix this issue and gives them a basic infrastructure framework as to how to fix it. So this is quite useful. Awesome. So if we're essentially using secure frameworks, this is our first step. And we want to use continuous scanning in order to continuously find escape hatches. So if we do use secure frameworks that maintain secure defaults, all we really need to do is actually detect the functions that let us escape from these secure defaults. So for instance, we might want to detect dangerously set inner HTML exec, raw SQL, my org.make superuser, etc. And let's go back to the topic of what tools can we use. So we talk about grep, which is pretty easy to use, easy to iterate on, but doesn't truly understand code, and code-aware linters, which are robust, super precise, but hard to actually write custom rules with. So is there anything else that sort of combines the easiness of grep with the powerfulness of a code-aware linter. So this is actually the tool that R2C has been working on, and we've been working on this for a year and a half almost. So SumGrep.dev is open source. It supports a lot of languages. It is a static analysis tool, but it has greater than 1,000 rules out of the box, and it doesn't require buildable source code. So I think the most awesome point of this is that it doesn't have a painful domain-specific languages, and essentially the patterns that you write with SumGrep look exactly like the code you're targeting. So it's pretty lightweight and customizable, and it was actually first built at Facebook in order to encourage some secure code patterns. So some pros about SumGrep is that it handles languages with more than one way to do this. And by this, we sort of mean that SumGrep is a little bit semantically aware in the sense that it is, the core is smart. So it knows, for instance, if you import bar as foo, that foo is actually bar. It also does some analysis such as constant propagation and other things. It's also a single tool for multiple languages, so you don't need to incorporate a lot of linters that support different languages into your ecosystem. It also has a pretty simple pattern language, so it's quite easy to learn and easy to add custom rules to. But some cons about SumGrep are that it's slower than grep, and not all languages are actually supported. Awesome. So now let's talk about this case study, which is R2C. So what do we do? Well, we do maintain SumGrep, and this is our main project. We maintain both a web app that lets you actually try out SumGrep on a live editor, and we maintain a CLI tool that you can brew install, pip install, and then use locally. So let's take a look at, again, this 5-step process that we talked about to eradicate vulnerability classes. So the first step was to evaluate which vulnerability class to focus on. Second, to determine the best approach. Third, to select the safe pattern and make it the default. And then we can train developers to use the safe pattern and use tools to enforce the safe pattern. So while we were thinking about selecting a vulnerability class, we talked about sort of using your vulnerability management program or historical commit data, things like that, in order to determine which you should prioritize. But R2C is actually pretty young, and we're a pretty small startup with only 2 primary code bases. And because of this, we have some pretty limited vulnerability history, and we couldn't really dig up a lot of commits with security fixes in order to find which vulnerability we should have prioritized. So instead, we prioritize based on the common problems for the type of application. So for web applications, we prioritized the cross-site scripting. And because we had a command line interface too, we prioritized code and command injection. So for the rest of the talk, I'll really be focusing on how we eliminated XSS from our code bases. Awesome. So the second step is to determine the best approach to prevent this at scale. So we had known good and bad code, so we therefore decided to go with lightweight static analysis. And we used SumGrep itself in order to prevent these escape hatches at scale. Awesome. So our next step was to select a safe pattern and make it the default. So we have a tech stack for a web application that is a Flask backend and a React front end. So because we're talking about how we eliminated XSS, for React, we banned dangerously set inner HTML, which is the main escape hatch for inserting user input as raw HTML. But for Flask, it was a little bit more complicated. So in order to actually secure Flask and make sure that there's no cross-site scripting vulnerabilities that got through, we needed to actually develop a secure default policy. And this is a screenshot of what we came up with. So we developed this XSS policy for Flask, and now we run it on our code. So the goal of a policy like this is essentially to say, if you follow these recommendations, you're pretty unlikely to have XSS. And in order to develop this, we use things like flash documentation. We used vulnerability research blogs. We actually did some security research. We scraped Git commits of public Flask repositories for keywords like fix XSS. And then we looked at the cross-site scripting vulnerabilities that this gave us. And then we sort of agglomerated this knowledge and came up with this policy. So we actually publicized this information, and the cheat sheets are on our blog, our documents actually in this link if you want to take a look at it. And we actually converted our policies into SEMGRUP rules, and then we compiled all of these rules into a rule pack for specific policies and vulnerability classes. So for example, we have an insecure transports vulnerability class pack, and we also have JWT and XSS. We also have code injection now, and we're continuing to work on these packs in order to make more and to make sure that we're covering everything. Awesome. So now that we've made secure defaults easier, we want to train developers to actually use the safe pattern. So we use at our company a combination of documentation, such as the policy you saw on the last slide, and also some descriptive feedback at the integration points. So our main integration points are IDE and CI, and essentially we have a SEMGRUP plugin for Vim and VS Code. So this is what we've been doing in order to tell developers to use safe patterns. And the fifth step is to use tools to enforce the safe pattern. So we have three main integration points, which are IDEs, our pre-commit hook, and GitHub Actions. So essentially, SEMGRUP runs for Vim and VS Code, also on pre-commit, and is integrated within our GitHub Actions. So we're actually able to manage our SEMGRUP policies using a cloud application that's expressly built for this purpose. So you can sign up for this, and we essentially manage this using that cloud dashboard. So we also measure developer interaction with our rules, and we put the results in front of the dashboards and calculate something called fix rate. So fix rate is essentially an approximation of how many issues that our developers are fixing. This really lets us know what rules are working, what rules really aren't, and whether our policies are good or not. And also, added benefit is that the security team almost never has to interact with the fix, and sometimes there's like some conversation about certain rules, and sometimes we fix the issues ourselves, but a majority of things are fixed without us ever being involved. Awesome, so let's wrap up this talk. So one thing that we're really excited about is that a number of OWASP members involved in the ASVS and cheat sheet projects have actually reached out to us, and we've started collaborating. So our idea is that these projects all have this awesome security expertise, and we want to make this knowledge a lot more accessible and useful to the members of the OWASP community. So some things we've been working on is sort of empowering security teams to run their program based on the ASV standard to be able to immediately and continuously know how they're doing across their company's ecosystem. We also want to enable security engineers to pretty easily audit the code they're responsible for and to determine when it doesn't follow ASVS best practices. We also want to give developers pretty immediate feedback at the time in their IDE and their CI. So if you want to get involved, please reach out. The link over here is to our Slack, and we want to just give pretty brief shout-outs to Daniel, Joe, and Rohit for actually contributing to SEMGRUP rules for the cheat sheet series. Awesome. So in conclusion, secure defaults are a great way to scalably raise your security bar. And playing bug whack-a-mole is hard but not scalable. Killing bug classes also makes your AppSec team more leveraged. And the process in doing this is to essentially pick a vulnerability class you want to eliminate, define a safe pattern, educate and roll this out, and then enforce this continuously using fast and lightweight static analysis. Awesome. So the slides are linked in this bit.ly link, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now.
Thanks, Colleen. One of the questions that I have related to your tool is obviously it works well with application security issues, but have you considered using it for infrastructure, like infrastructure as code or Docker, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, for sure. We've actually rolled out a bunch of rules for infrastructure as code, and I think it's also a good way to handle things like Terraform, like Docker, etc. This talk is mostly focused on the application security side of it, but can definitely see this being applied to infrastructure as code.
Yeah, totally. I mean, if it has that, like if it's in code, it might have well be scanned by this tool, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, for sure. We recently also released like YAML support, so it's even easier to write rules for us.
Awesome. Are there any other questions in the comments for Colleen?
Yeah, there seems to be one. So Kalev asks, what about high impact, low false positive rate findings? Do we just discard them?
So we do want low false positive rates and high impacts, and these findings are exactly what we want. The findings that we don't want are the ones that have high false positive rates, and basically are a bunch of noise to the developers. If you do have things that are like high impact and high false positive rates, you can add them to your, for instance, audit workflow in order to just have a better idea of what's going on. Because we don't want to block developers on things that are high false positive rates, but we might want to just keep an eye out and see what's going on.
Okay, I think you did end up answering Kalev's question regardless. The comment was that they've seen many queries in other SaaS tools that are costly to triage but are worth keeping and having a security specialist work through. So do you have any commentary about how to make that work in a cost-effective way or in a better way than what we than currently is the practice, which is just go through all of them?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, would you mind repeating the question one more time?
Yeah. So what do you do? I think you answered it, but can you repeat what do you do about high impact, high false positive rate findings?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely. So I would say that you would keep them in your audit workflow and just essentially keep an eye out. We don't want to develop, or we don't want to block developers because high false positive rate makes developers actually lose trust in your SaaS tool. So having a separate alternative workflow like audit and letting your security engineers just keep an eye out for those high false positive rates and high impact rules is pretty useful. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Any
Yeah.
other questions or comments from the audience? Sorry, go ahead, Adam.
Oh no, I was literally going to ask what.
So what's next for you guys in terms of research on this front?
Yeah, that's a great question. Currently, I think we're doing a lot more development work with the security team. We're doing a lot of metrics stuff. So, role performance, how to get that down, things like that. So, currently, we're doing a lot of benchmarking, but perhaps one day we'll go back to security research stuff.
Nice. Anything specific that you're looking to benchmark first?
I think mainly role performance. We just want to get down the rates, or especially outliers that take a lot of time, especially since CI costs money, and we don't want to suck up people's money like that.
Totally makes sense. Yeah. Okay. There's a comment and a question. It seems like a good strategy for new applications when we can drive developers to use modern frameworks that are more secure. What about legacy applications? Have you thought about any way to cover and vulnerability classes there?
Yeah, definitely for legacy applications, it's much harder, especially if there's like a lot of backwards compatibility you want to keep. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, for instance, if you have a legacy application that's not using secure frameworks, maybe moving towards migrating towards secure frameworks is a good idea. And if that can't happen, things like, for instance, as we were talking about like the Microsoft XP to Vista case, things like just banning functions that we know are super insecure, string copy, even string and copy, things like that. Still a good strategy. I think it's always go after the low hanging fruit first and then tackling other things.
Okay, thank you. And then another question is, what is the state of Rust support today in some grep?
That's an excellent question. So we actually have an external contributor who added the CSC to AST translation of Rust, but not all of it. So I think Rust expressions work, but not all expressions. Rust statements, I think, are sort of iffy. Um, and I think one thing that we do have is a generic matcher where you can write a generic pattern and match any type of code. So I think that sometimes can work well with Rust. But I don't think Rust is going to be our focus in the future. Our next steps are C# supports, and I'm not super sure when we'll start supporting Rust actually.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple of comments about, about just how great people think SumGrep is. Khalif was mentioning that it's the first tool they actually like. So it's good news all around.
Yeah, definitely high praise. Wow, that's awesome, honestly.
Let's give people another couple of minutes to maybe ask any residual questions they have. Mm. Any other tips for the audience, like things you would have put into this presentation if you could have? Any topics of mine that you were like working on talks for, things like that?
Oh yeah, I would say, I guess one thing I wanted to mention is how powerful a tool autofix is. Um, yeah, I think I mentioned this briefly, but essentially having a suggestion for developers that is even not functional will help them actually move towards the right answer. So even if you do an autofix thing that doesn't quite work, it's still helpful to developers. So that's nice to include. Yeah, and I guess our latest our latest security research that we did was on eliminating cross-site scripting and pointing out cross-site scripting bugs through historical GitHub data. And we sort of analyzed how actually secure defaults does in the real world through GitHub historical data. And we were actually able to detect greater than 50% of all XSS vulnerabilities using secure defaults. So it's actually pretty effective.
Do you have a link that we can share with the audience around that?
Yeah, so we're going to be releasing a sort of it's like a blog post, but it's so long that it's like more like a white paper.
Great, fair enough.
Yeah, we'll be releasing that soon. So on our blog. So yeah, just I'll send you the link once that comes out.
Perfect.
Yeah, kind of on that line of thinking. Do you guys ever look at like bug bounty reports and see how those findings are found and kind of reverse engineer those?
Yeah, I think we haven't really looked at bug bounty reports, but that's a really good idea to dive into those. What we did basically during our research was looking at historical Git commits that had things like fix and then XSS in them, and then just analyzing whether we could have caught them. But yeah, that's a good idea to also loop in bug bounty reports.
Yeah, definitely, because sometimes they even show you like, exactly where the issue is, especially open source code. So yeah, it might help.
Yeah, for sure. The more data, the better.
Definitely. Is there any other questions from the comments there?
There are some people thanking you for your presentation.
Okay, thanks
We
for
don't
listening.
we don't seem to have any more questions at the moment.
Yeah,
Okay.
all right. I think it's probably been enough time. Of course, they can always reach out to you, Colleen, if they have any other questions. But we will be uploading your slides as well as these videos, so anybody can just watch it if they're looking for your contact details. But thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been a great time having Colleen here, and also big thanks to our sponsors who are HP. Checkmarks, Security Compass, Sonatype, Security Innovation, Amazon, and Shopify. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And yeah, take care. Take it easy. We'll see
Thanks
you
again,
next
Colleen.
time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Colleen.